The emergency room erupted into chaos when 3 intoxicated college students stumbled through the sliding doors, their voices echoing off the sterile walls as they demanded immediate attention for what appeared to be nothing more than scraped knuckles and bruised egos. The smallest one, barely 19 with bleached hair and designer clothes that screamed privilege, spotted the woman sitting quietly in the corner and decided she'd found her target for the evening's entertainment. What happened next would forever change how everyone in that room understood the difference between appearance and reality. Because sometimes, the most unassuming person carries the heaviest burden, and respect isn't something you withhold until someone proves they deserve it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital cast everything in harsh, clinical shadows that seemed to leach the warmth from even the most compassionate faces. It was the kind of lighting that made everyone look tired, sick, or older than their years. And tonight it was working overtime on the emergency room staff, who'd been pulling double shifts since the holiday weekend began. Sarah Martinez sat in chair number 17, the same molded plastic seat she'd occupied for the past 4 hours while waiting for her name to be called. The emergency room moved at its own pace, dictated by the severity of injuries rather than the order of arrival. And she understood that better than most. Her left arm hung in a makeshift sling fashioned from a torn pillowcase, the fabric stained with dried blood that had turned from bright red to the color of rust. At first glance, she looked like any other patient waiting for medical attention. Mid-30s, medium height, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that had seen better hours. Her jeans were worn at the knees, not from fashion but from actual wear, and her flannel shirt had the kind of softness that came from countless washings rather than expensive fabric treatments. She wore no makeup, carried no purse, and the only jewelry visible was a simple silver chain that disappeared beneath her collar. What most people noticed first was how still she sat. Not the restless fidgeting of someone in pain or the anxious shifting of someone worried about medical bills, but the kind of absolute stillness that made some people uncomfortable when they really paid attention to it. She didn't check her phone, didn't tap her foot, didn't crane her neck to see how many people were ahead of her in line. She simply sat and waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that some things couldn't be rushed, no matter how much you wanted them to be. The injury that brought her to the emergency room had happened 6 hours earlier at the construction site, where she worked as a safety inspector. A crane operator had lost hydraulic pressure at exactly the wrong moment, sending a steel beam swinging in an arc that would have crushed 2 workers if someone hadn't been in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to push them clear. The beam had caught her instead, driving her shoulder into a concrete pillar with enough force to separate the joint and tear muscles that would take months to heal properly. But she hadn't mentioned any of that to the triage nurse, just said she'd hurt her shoulder at work and needed it looked at when they had time. The nurse had taken one look at her calm demeanor and obvious lack of insurance paperwork, made some assumptions about the urgency of her condition, and assigned her a priority number that meant she'd be waiting until the real emergencies were handled. Sarah didn't mind. She'd waited in worse places for better reasons, and at least here she was warm and dry. The chairs might have been designed by someone who'd never actually sat in one, but they were better than a foxhole in winter or the back of a transport truck bouncing across terrain that didn't appear on any official maps. The coffee from the vending machine tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration, but it was hot and caffeinated, which made it better than a lot of beverages she'd consumed over the years. The emergency room's population shifted constantly as the night wore on. Families clustered around elderly relatives who'd fallen at home. Young parents juggled crying babies while trying to fill out forms with one hand. Construction workers nursed injuries that looked worse than they were, and office workers fretted over injuries that were worse than they looked. Everyone had their own crisis, their own priorities, their own reasons for being there instead of somewhere more comfortable. Around midnight, the character of the waiting room began to change. The families with non-urgent conditions had either been seen or had given up and gone home. The construction workers had been patched up and released with instructions to follow up with their regular doctors. What remained were the true emergencies, the chronic conditions that flared up at inconvenient times, and the people who had nowhere else to go on a Friday night in a city that never quite slept but sometimes dozed restlessly. That's when the college students arrived. They announced their presence before they were even through the doors, their voices carrying the particular volume that came from expensive alcohol and the kind of confidence that had never been tested by real consequences. 3 young women, all blonde, all wearing outfits that cost more than most people made in a week, all absolutely convinced that their minor injuries deserved immediate attention from medical professionals who were currently trying to save actual lives. The leader of the group was named Ashley, though she introduced herself to anyone who would listen as Ashley Morrison, as in Morrison Construction, as in you probably work for my dad. She was 20 years old, a junior at the local university, studying something that sounded important, but didn't require her to actually show up for classes very often. Her parents had given her a credit card with no limit and a car that cost more than most people's houses, but they'd forgotten to give her the kind of character that made any of those things worthwhile. Her injury consisted of a small cut on her hand that she'd received when she'd punched a bathroom mirror in a nightclub after someone had criticized her choice of music. The cut was superficial, barely deep enough to require a bandage, but she'd managed to convince her friends that it was life-threatening and demanded immediate medical attention. More importantly, she'd convinced herself that her family's wealth and social position meant she shouldn't have to wait behind people who were obviously beneath her station. Her companions, Jessica and Brittany, had their own minor scrapes and bruises from an evening that had started with expensive cocktails and ended with them being escorted out of 3 different establishments for behavior that ranged from obnoxious to potentially criminal. They weren't particularly injured, but they were definitely drunk, and the emergency room was the only place they could think of where they could continue their evening's entertainment without having to pay for drinks. The triage nurse, a woman named Patricia, who'd been working the emergency rooms for 15 years and had seen every type of human behavior imaginable, took one look at the 3 young women and knew exactly what kind of night she was about to have. She processed their paperwork with professional efficiency, assigned them appropriate priority numbers, and directed them to the waiting area with the kind of polite firmness that emergency room staff developed as a survival mechanism. Ashley looked around the waiting room with the expression of someone who'd just discovered that not everyone lived in the same world she did. The plastic chairs, the fluorescent lighting, the vending machines that offered candy bars and coffee that probably wouldn't meet her usual standards. But most importantly, she saw the other people waiting for medical attention, and in her alcohol-impaired judgment, she decided they were exactly the kind of audience she needed for whatever performance she was planning to give. Her eyes settled on Sarah almost immediately. Here was someone who looked different from the other patients. Quieter, calmer, but also somehow separate from everyone else in a way that Ashley's privileged upbringing had taught her to interpret as weakness rather than strength. Someone who sat alone, didn't complain about the wait, and seemed to accept her circumstances without the kind of entitled indignation that Ashley considered appropriate for anyone dealing with substandard service. Perfect. Ashley nudged Jessica and pointed towards Sarah with the kind of theatrical subtlety that drunk college students considered inconspicuous. "Look at that one over there," she said, her voice carrying just far enough to ensure that several other patients could hear. "Probably doesn't even have insurance. Bet she's been sitting there all night, hoping someone will take pity on her." Jessica giggled, the sound sharp and artificial in the quiet waiting room. Maybe we should tell her about the free clinic across town. I mean, there are places for people like that, right? Brittany, who had spent the evening trying to keep up with her more aggressive friends, felt a moment of uncertainty as she looked at Sarah. Something about the woman's posture, the way she held herself despite obviously being in pain, suggested that perhaps she wasn't the easy target Ashley seemed to think she was. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the alcohol in her system and her desire to fit in with her friends overrode whatever instinct might have warned her to look more carefully before making assumptions. Should we say something to her? Brittany asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with whatever her friends were planning. Ashley stood up from her chair with the kind of exaggerated movement that drunk people used when they wanted to make sure everyone noticed they were doing something important. Her designer heels clicked against the linoleum floor as she walked across the waiting room, her friends trailing behind like satellites orbiting a particularly toxic planet. Sarah noticed their approach, of course. You don't spend years in situations where awareness meant the difference between life and death without developing the kind of peripheral vision that tracked movement even when you appeared to be focused on something else. She'd been watching the three young women since they arrived, not because they interested her particularly, but because their behavior suggested they might become a problem for someone before the night was over. She just hadn't expected that someone to be her. Ashley stopped directly in front of Sarah's chair, close enough that the smell of expensive perfume mixed with alcohol was unmistakable. She looked down at the seated woman with the expression of someone who was about to do what she considered a good deed, though her definition of good deeds tended to focus more on the doing than on the receiving. "Excuse me," Ashley said, her voice carrying the kind of false sweetness that people used when they wanted to sound helpful while being anything but. "I couldn't help but notice you've been sitting here for a really long time. Are you sure you're in the right place? I mean, this is the emergency room, not the free clinic." Sarah looked up at Ashley with calm, steady eyes that gave away nothing of what she was thinking. She didn't respond immediately, taking a moment to assess not just the young woman standing in front of her, but also the small crowd of other patients who were now paying attention to what was clearly going to be some kind of confrontation. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Sarah said finally, her voice quiet but clear enough to carry to the edges of the waiting room. "Thank you for your concern." Ashley's smile tightened slightly. She'd expected embarrassment, maybe gratitude, for being offered helpful advice about more appropriate medical facilities. She hadn't expected the kind of calm dignity that made her feel like maybe she was the one who didn't belong in this situation. "It's just that you look like you might be more comfortable somewhere that caters to people in your particular circumstances," Ashley continued, her voice getting a little louder as her friends moved closer to form a semicircle around Sarah's chair. "I mean, we all want to make sure everyone gets the care they can afford, right?" The waiting room had gone almost completely silent now. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people turned to watch what was happening in the corner. Even the staff behind the reception desk had noticed the change in atmosphere, though they were too far away to hear exactly what was being said. Sarah remained seated, her injured arm resting in its makeshift sling, her good hand relaxed in her lap. She looked at each of the three young women in turn, taking their measure with the kind of assessment that most people never realized was happening. Jessica, trying to look tough but clearly uncomfortable with the direction this was heading. Brittany, drunk enough to go along with whatever happened, but sober enough to understand that it probably wasn't going to end well. And Ashley, so wrapped up in her own sense of superiority that she couldn't see how badly she was misjudging the situation. "And what circumstances would those be?" Sarah asked, her tone remaining perfectly level despite the increasing hostility of the people surrounding her. Ashley's friends exchanged glances, recognizing the question as some kind of challenge, but not quite understanding its significance. Ashley herself seemed to take it as permission to be more explicit about what she'd been implying. "Well, I mean, look at you," Ashley said, gesturing broadly at Sarah's clothes, her position in the waiting room, her general appearance. "No offense, but you're obviously not someone who can afford the kind of medical care this hospital provides. And that's fine, but there are places specifically designed for people in your situation. Social services can probably help you find something more appropriate." The silence that followed was different from the quiet attention the waiting room had been giving to their conversation. This was the kind of silence that preceded something significant, though most of the people listening couldn't have said exactly what they were expecting to happen. Sarah stood up slowly, careful not to jar her injured shoulder, but moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with someone who'd been sitting in an uncomfortable chair for 4 hours. As she rose to her full height, she didn't tower over Ashley physically, but something about her presence made the young woman take an involuntary step backward. "You seem to know a lot about my circumstances," Sarah said, her voice still quiet, but carrying a new quality that made everyone listening pay closer attention. "What else can you tell me about myself?" Ashley felt the conversation slipping away from her control, but her pride and the alcohol in her system wouldn't let her back down. If anything, Sarah's calm response seemed to infuriate her more, as if the older woman's refusal to be embarrassed or intimidated was somehow cheating. "I can tell you're trying to get medical care you can't pay for," Ashley shot back, her voice rising enough that the reception staff definitely heard her now. "I can tell you're taking up space that should go to people who actually belong here. And I can tell you're too proud to admit that you're in over your head." She stepped closer to Sarah, close enough that the height difference was obvious. Ashley was taller, younger, and surrounded by friends who would back up whatever she decided to do. In her experience, that was enough to make most people back down from any confrontation. "Maybe it's time someone helped you face reality," Ashley continued, reaching out towards Sarah's injured arm. "Starting with that little costume you're wearing to try to get sympathy." What happened next unfolded so quickly that most of the people watching would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. Ashley grabbed the collar of Sarah's flannel shirt, presumably intending to examine it more closely, or perhaps to demonstrate her physical dominance over someone she saw as weak and vulnerable. The fabric, already stressed from the day's events and torn in several places from Sarah's injury, gave way immediately. The shirt came apart in Ashley's hands, the remaining buttons popping loose and the fabric separating along seams that had been weakened by impact with concrete and steel. Sarah made no move to stop her, didn't flinch or pull away, just stood there as her shirt was effectively torn from her body, leaving her upper torso covered only by a simple white tank top that had also seen better days. Ashley stepped back, with pieces of flannel still clutched in her hands, a triumphant smile on her face as she prepared to make some comment about what she'd revealed. The smile lasted exactly as long as it took her to focus on what was now visible on Sarah's left shoulder. The tattoo covered most of Sarah's upper arm and shoulder, extending from just below her collarbone to halfway down her bicep. It wasn't the kind of decorative artwork that most people associated with tattoos, nothing meant to be pretty or personally meaningful. This was something else entirely. The central image was a 5-pointed star surrounded by a wreath, rendered in black ink that had been applied by someone who understood that this particular design needed to be perfect. The star itself was detailed with precision that spoke of military accuracy, each point sharp and clean, the proportions exactly matching specifications that most civilians would never see. The wreath surrounding it was composed of oak leaves and laurel branches, symbols that carried meaning beyond their decorative value. But it was the text that made Ashley's smile disappear entirely. Curved above and below the central design, in the kind of formal lettering reserved for the most solemn occasions, were words that changed everything about how everyone in that waiting room understood the woman standing in front of them. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Below that, in smaller but equally precise text, Operation Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan, 2019. And at the bottom, the words that made Jessica gasp audibly and caused Brittany to take several steps backward: Medal of Honor recipient. The silence that followed was absolute. Not just quiet, but the kind of complete absence of sound that occurs when an entire room of people suddenly realizes they've been witnessing something they didn't understand. Even the ambient noise of the hospital seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Ashley stared at the tattoo for several long seconds, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The Medal of Honor wasn't just another military decoration. It was the highest award for valor that the United States could bestow, reserved for actions so far beyond the normal expectations of courage that they defied easy comprehension, and it was incredibly rare. So rare that most people went there entire lives without ever meeting someone who'd received one. The pieces of Sarah's shirt fell from Ashley's hands to the floor, landing with the soft sound of fabric hitting linoleum. She looked up from the tattoo to meet Sarah's eyes, and for the first time that evening, she saw something there that made her understand exactly how badly she'd misjudged the situation. Sarah's expression hadn't changed. She still stood with the same calm dignity she'd maintained throughout the confrontation, her injured arm still supported by the makeshift sling, her good hand still relaxed at her side. But now Ashley could see past the worn clothes and the lack of traditional markers of success to the quality of attention Sarah had been giving her all along. This wasn't the patient tolerance of someone who couldn't fight back. This was the measured assessment of someone who'd spent years in situations where the wrong decision could cost lives. "You wanted to know about my circumstances," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority it had maintained throughout the evening. "Would you like me to tell you about them?" Ashley opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Around the waiting room, other patients had begun to understand what they were looking at. A man in his 60s who'd been waiting with his wife for treatment of her chest pain stood up slowly, recognition dawning in his eyes. He'd served in Vietnam, had seen enough of military culture to understand the significance of what Ashley had just revealed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the kind of respect that couldn't be faked or learned from books. "I apologize for what just happened here. Some of us know better." Sarah turned to acknowledge him with a slight nod, the kind of gesture that passed between people who understood each other without needing extended conversation. When she looked back at Ashley, the young woman was still staring at the tattoo as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "The Medal of Honor isn't given for following orders," Sarah said, her tone taking on the quality of someone explaining something important to someone who needed to understand it. "It's not awarded for doing your job well, or for being brave when bravery is expected. It's reserved for those moments when someone makes a choice that no reasonable person should be expected to make, when they risk everything to save others, even though they know it will probably cost them their own life." She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "Would you like to know what I did to earn this tattoo? Or would you prefer to continue telling me about the circumstances you think you understand?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying weight that went far beyond the simple words. Ashley found herself facing a choice she'd never expected to confront. She could continue with her original plan to humiliate someone she'd dismissed as weak and unimportant, or she could acknowledge that she'd made assumptions about someone whose actual circumstances were so far beyond her experience that she had no framework for understanding them. Around the waiting room, other conversations had stopped entirely. Everyone was watching now, not with the casual interest of people observing an argument, but with the focused attention of people who understood they were witnessing something significant. The reception staff had noticed the change in atmosphere. and were clearly preparing to intervene if necessary, though they seemed uncertain about exactly what kind of intervention might be appropriate. Sarah reached down and picked up the largest piece of her torn shirt, examining it with the kind of practical assessment that suggested she was already thinking about how to make do with what remained. The motion caused her to wince slightly, as her injured shoulder protested, reminding everyone present that she was still a patient waiting for medical care, despite everything else that had been revealed. "I think," she said, looking back at Ashley with an expression that might have been sympathy if it hadn't been so carefully controlled, "that you and your friends might want to reconsider how you approach people you don't know. Not everyone is what they appear to be, and assumptions based on appearances have a way of revealing more about the person making them than about the person they're directed toward." Ashley's friends had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now Jessica stepped forward slightly, though she was careful to maintain distance from both Sarah and Ashley. She looked at the tattoo, then at Sarah's face, then back at the tattoo as if she couldn't quite reconcile what she was seeing with what she'd expected to find. "Are you really?" Jessica began, then stopped and swallowed hard before continuing. "Did you really win the Medal of Honor?" Sarah considered the question for a moment before answering. "No one wins the Medal of Honor," she said quietly. "It's not a competition or a game. People receive it because they made choices that saved other people's lives at a time when those lives couldn't be saved any other way. And usually, the people who receive it would trade it back in a heartbeat if it meant the circumstances that required those choices had never existed in the first place." The waiting room had become so quiet that the sound of the automatic doors opening at the far end of the hall was clearly audible. A new patient was arriving, someone else with their own emergency, their own crisis, their own need for medical attention. Life was continuing around them, reminding everyone present that whatever was happening in this corner of the emergency room was just one small moment in a much larger world. But for the people directly involved, this moment had become something that would reshape how they understood their place in that world. Ashley stood with the torn remnants of Sarah's shirt still scattered around her feet, forced to confront the reality that her assumptions about strength, weakness, worthiness, and circumstance had been not just wrong, but so thoroughly misguided that she'd essentially attacked someone whose service to her country had been recognized at the highest possible level. Brittany finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "We didn't know," she said, the words sounding inadequate even as she spoke them. "We thought you thought I was just what?" Sarah asked, her tone still patient, but carrying an edge that suggested patience wasn't unlimited. "Someone who didn't deserve basic respect? Someone whose circumstances you could judge based on the clothes she wore or the chair she sat in?" The questions weren't rhetorical. Sarah genuinely seemed to want answers, as if understanding how they'd reached this point was important for reasons that went beyond the immediate situation. She looked at each of the three young women in turn, waiting for someone to explain the logic that had led them to believe that tearing a stranger's clothing was an appropriate way to make whatever point they'd been trying to make. Ashley finally managed to speak, though her voice had lost all the confidence it had carried when she'd first approached Sarah's chair. "We thought you were taking advantage," she said, the words coming out in a rush as if getting them out quickly might somehow make them less terrible. "We thought you were trying to get free medical care you didn't deserve." "And what made you think you had the right to make that determination?" Sarah asked. "What qualified you to decide who deserves medical care and who doesn't?" The question hit its target with surgical precision. Ashley's worldview was built on the assumption that her family's wealth and social position gave her not just advantages, but actual authority over people she considered beneath her station. She'd grown up in a world where her opinions mattered because of who her father was, where her judgments carried weight because of where she went to school, where her decisions about other people were validated by a social circle that shared her assumptions about how the world worked. But standing in an emergency room at 2 in the morning, faced with someone whose actual accomplishments made her inherited privileges look like party favors, Ashley was forced to confront the possibility that her entire understanding of worth and authority might be fundamentally flawed. The Medal of Honor tattoo seemed to grow more significant the longer she looked at it, not because it was getting larger, but because she was beginning to understand what it represented. This wasn't just military decoration. This was recognition of the kind of courage that most people couldn't even imagine, the kind of selflessness that redefined what it meant to serve others, the kind of sacrifice that made concepts like social position and family wealth seem trivial by comparison. And she'd tried to humiliate the person who carried it. The realization was hitting her in waves, each one making her feel smaller and more ashamed than the last. She looked around the waiting room and saw that everyone was still watching, still waiting to see how this would resolve. Some faces showed sympathy for her predicament, understanding that anyone could make mistakes when they didn't have all the information. But others showed a different kind of judgment, the kind that came from people who'd learned not to make assumptions about others based on surface appearances. Sarah seemed to understand that Ashley was struggling with something larger than just embarrassment about a single incident. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out a small wallet, the kind of worn leather accessory that looked like it had been carried through more situations than most people experienced in a lifetime. From the wallet, she extracted what appeared to be a standard military identification card, though the format was slightly different from what most people would recognize. She held it out toward Ashley, not aggressively, but as an offer. "If you're genuinely curious about my circumstances," Sarah said, "you're welcome to see what they actually are instead of guessing." Ashley hesitated for a moment, then reached out to take the card. As soon as she looked at it, she understood that her night was about to get significantly worse. The ID identified Sarah Martinez as a retired Master Sergeant, Special Operations Forces, with a service record that included deployments to Iraq, Afghanistan, and several other locations that were listed only as classified operations. But it was the small photograph attached to the ID that made Ashley's stomach drop. The woman in the picture was younger, wearing dress uniform with a chest full of ribbons and decorations that spoke to a level of service Ashley had never imagined. But it was unmistakably the same person who was now standing in front of her, in torn clothes and a makeshift sling, waiting patiently for medical care like any other emergency room patient. Ashley handed the ID back with shaking hands, finally understanding the full scope of what she'd done. She hadn't just made assumptions about a stranger's financial situation. She hadn't just been rude to someone who was injured and waiting for help. She'd physically assaulted a decorated combat veteran whose service record represented the kind of sacrifice that made her own comfortable life possible. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible in the quiet waiting room. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I thought—" "You thought what you wanted to think," Sarah said, tucking the ID back into her wallet with practiced efficiency. "You saw someone who didn't fit your expectations about what important people look like, and you decided that meant they weren't important. You saw someone who wasn't displaying wealth or status in ways you recognized, and you assumed they had no wealth or status worth respecting." Sarah's voice remained calm throughout this assessment, but there was something in her tone that suggested she'd encountered this kind of thinking before and understood its implications better than Ashley did. "But here's what you missed," Sarah continued, "and what you need to understand if you're going to learn anything from this situation. The most important qualities a person can have aren't visible from across a waiting room. Courage, integrity, commitment to something larger than yourself, willingness to sacrifice for others. None of these things show up in the clothes someone wears or the car they drive or the way they carry themselves when they're injured and tired." She gestured slightly toward the other patients in the waiting room. People who had been watching this entire exchange with expressions ranging from sympathy to judgment to fascination. Every person in this room has a story you don't know. Every person here has faced challenges you can't imagine and made choices you've never had to make. Some of them have served their country in ways that will never be publicly recognized. Some have served their communities in ways that save lives every day. Some have overcome obstacles that would have defeated you before you started. Ashley found herself looking around the waiting room with new eyes, seeing the other patients not as background characters in her own drama, but as individuals whose circumstances she'd been just as quick to judge and dismiss as she had Sarah's. The older man who'd stood up to apologize was still watching her with a mixture of disappointment and hope, as if he was waiting to see whether she was capable of learning from what had just happened. "The point," Sarah said, her voice becoming gentler without losing any of its authority, "isn't that you should have known who I was before you decided to approach me. The point is that you should approach everyone with the same basic respect you'd show if you knew they were someone whose service and sacrifice had been recognized at the highest levels." The lesson was delivered without malice, but with the kind of clarity that made it impossible to misunderstand or ignore. Ashley felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, not from embarrassment, though there was plenty of that, but from the growing understanding of how fundamentally wrong her approach to other people had been. Jessica and Brittany had remained silent throughout this exchange, but now they moved closer to Ashley, not in support of her original position, but in recognition that their friend was facing something that was going to change her permanently. They could see the impact of Sarah's words, could see the way Ashley was struggling to reconcile her worldview with the reality of what had just been revealed. "What can we do?" Brittany asked, her voice small but sincere. "How do we make this right?" Sarah considered the question seriously, taking time to think about what might actually be helpful rather than just offering empty reassurance. "You can start by understanding that this isn't about me," she said finally. "This is about how you treat people when you think no one important is watching. It's about whether you extend basic human dignity to others, based on their humanity rather than their ability to demand respect through displays of wealth or power or status." She looked at each of the three young women in turn, making sure they understood that her next words were directed at all of them. "You can commit to approaching people differently in the future. You can recognize that everyone deserves basic respect until they prove they don't deserve it, rather than making them prove they do deserve it. And you can remember that the most important contributions people make to the world are often invisible to casual observers." The automatic doors at the entrance opened again, and this time the person who entered was clearly a member of the hospital staff. A middle-aged woman in scrubs approached the reception desk and had a brief, quiet conversation with the staff there. Ashley could see them gesturing toward the corner where the confrontation had taken place, and she realized that someone had probably reported the incident to hospital security. Sarah noticed the conversation as well, but she didn't seem concerned about it. If anything, she appeared to be using the moment to assess whether the immediate situation had been resolved, or whether there were still issues that needed to be addressed. "Sarah Martinez?" a voice called from the reception desk. "We're ready for you now." Sarah turned toward the voice and nodded acknowledgement, then looked back at Ashley and her friends. The torn shirt was still scattered around their feet, and Sarah was still wearing only the tank top that had been underneath it, but she seemed more concerned with making sure the lesson had been understood than with her own immediate comfort. "I need to go take care of this shoulder," she said, gesturing slightly toward her injured arm. "But I want you to think about something while I'm gone. You assumed I was here because I couldn't afford to go anywhere else. The truth is, I'm here because this is where I was told to come after the injury occurred. My medical care is fully covered through the Veterans Administration, and I have access to some of the best trauma treatment available anywhere in the country." She paused to let that information sink in before continuing. But even if your assumptions had been correct, even if I had been someone without insurance or resources or connections, would that have justified the way you treated me? Does someone's financial situation determine whether they deserve basic human dignity? The questions hung in the air as Sarah began walking toward the reception desk, leaving Ashley and her friends to contemplate answers they weren't sure they were ready to give. As Sarah passed the older veteran who had apologized earlier, he stood up again and spoke quietly to her. "Thank you for your service, ma'am. And I'm sorry about what happened here tonight." Sarah stopped and looked at him with genuine warmth, the first truly positive expression she'd shown since the confrontation began. "Thank you," she said simply, "and thank you for yours." The brief exchange reminded everyone watching that there were bonds between people who'd served that went beyond rank or recognition or even specific knowledge of each other's service records. It was a reminder that respect and understanding could be built on shared experience and mutual recognition of sacrifice, even between strangers. As Sarah disappeared through the doors that led to the treatment areas, the waiting room began to return to its normal rhythm. Conversations resumed, though many of them were now focused on what everyone had just witnessed. The 3 college students remained standing where the confrontation had taken place, surrounded by pieces of torn fabric and the weight of understanding that their assumptions about the world had been fundamentally challenged. Ashley bent down and began collecting the pieces of Sarah's shirt, though she wasn't sure what she intended to do with them. The fabric felt different in her hands now, not like the costume of someone trying to appear more humble than they were, but like the practical clothing of someone who chose function over appearance because she had more important things to worry about than impressing strangers. "We really messed up," Jessica said quietly, stating the obvious but needing to say it out loud. "Yeah," Ashley agreed, her voice hollow with the recognition of just how badly they'd misjudged the situation. "We really did." But as she stood there holding pieces of a combat veteran's torn shirt, Ashley began to understand that the real question wasn't whether they'd made a mistake. The real question was what they were going to do with the knowledge they'd gained from making that mistake. Whether they would let this moment change how they approached other people in the future, or whether they would find ways to rationalize it as an isolated incident that didn't require them to examine their fundamental assumptions about worth, respect, and human dignity. The lesson had been offered. Whether they chose to learn from it was up to them. The treatment room felt different from the waiting area, smaller and more intimate, with medical equipment that hummed quietly and walls painted in the kind of soothing blue that hospitals used to convince people that everything was going to be fine. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been working emergency medicine for 12 years, long enough to develop the kind of professional composure that allowed her to treat everything from paper cuts to gunshot wounds with the same methodical attention to detail. But as she reviewed the chart that had just been handed to her, she found herself reading the patient information twice to make sure she'd understood it correctly. The injury itself was straightforward enough, a separated shoulder with possible ligament damage, the kind of workplace accident that she saw several times a week. What caught her attention was the medical history section, which contained references to previous trauma treatment that suggested this patient had experienced injuries that most people never survived, let alone recovered from completely. Sarah sat on the examination table wearing a hospital gown that had seen better years, her torn shirt folded neatly on the chair beside her. The makeshift sling had been replaced with a proper medical support, but she still held her injured arm with the careful attention of someone who understood that healing required patience and discipline. Her posture remained straight despite the pain, a habit ingrained by years of training that had taught her that how you carried yourself affected not just how others saw you, but how you saw yourself. Dr. Vasquez entered the room with the confident stride of someone accustomed to taking control of situations. But she slowed slightly as she got her first clear look at Sarah. There was something about the woman's bearing that suggested this wasn't going to be a routine examination. though she couldn't have explained exactly what made her think so. "Ms. Martinez," Dr. Vasquez said, settling onto the rolling stool that allowed her to move around the examination area efficiently. "I understand you injured your shoulder at work earlier today. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Sarah provided a concise account of the accident, describing the mechanical failure and the chain of events that had led to her being struck by the swinging beam. Her narrative was precise and factual, delivered without unnecessary drama or requests for sympathy. She spoke like someone giving a professional briefing, focusing on the relevant details while omitting anything that wasn't directly related to the medical situation at hand. Dr. Vasquez found herself listening not just to what Sarah was saying, but to how she was saying it. The vocabulary was specific and accurate, suggesting familiarity with trauma and emergency situations that went beyond what most civilians possessed. The way she described the forces involved in the accident, the mechanism of injury, and her immediate response afterward indicated someone who understood both the technical and medical aspects of what had happened to her. "Have you had shoulder injuries before?" Dr. Vasquez asked, beginning her physical examination with the gentle touch of someone who knew that injured people often carried more pain than they were willing to admit. "A few," Sarah replied, her tone suggesting that the definition of a few might be relative. "Nothing exactly like this, but I've had some experience with joint separation and ligament damage." As Dr. Vasquez worked, she noticed details that most medical professionals would have missed. The way Sarah responded to different types of pressure and movement indicated someone who had learned to assess her own injuries with considerable accuracy. The small scars visible on her arms and shoulders spoke to a history of trauma that extended far beyond workplace accidents. Most significantly, the way she held still during procedures that were clearly painful suggested a level of physical discipline that came from extensive training in pain management. "Your medical history mentions previous treatment for what's listed as combat-related trauma," Dr. Vasquez said, her tone carefully neutral. "Can you tell me more about that? It might affect how we approach your treatment." Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering how much information was necessary for proper medical care, and how much was simply personal history that didn't need to be shared with someone she'd just met. In her experience, most medical professionals were competent and well-intentioned, but few of them had any real understanding of the kinds of injuries that came from situations where people were actively trying to kill you. "I served in Afghanistan," she said finally. "Multiple deployments over several years. I sustained various injuries during that time, but they were all properly treated and fully healed. This is unrelated to any of that." Dr. Vasquez nodded, but something in Sarah's tone suggested there was more to the story than she was sharing. The medical records that had been transferred from the VA hospital contained references to treatments and procedures that indicated injuries far more severe than various shrapnel removal, reconstructive surgery, extended rehabilitation for trauma that had required months of recovery. The kind of medical history that suggested someone who had been very close to death and had fought their way back to full function through determination and excellent medical care. But more than that, there was something about the way Sarah responded to the examination that suggested experience with medical professionals who understood combat injuries. She anticipated certain procedures, positioned herself for maximum efficiency during others, and showed none of the anxiety or uncertainty that most people displayed when dealing with serious injuries. "Are you currently receiving any VA benefits or medical support?" Dr. Vasquez asked, partly for medical reasons but partly out of genuine curiosity about someone whose service record was clearly more extensive than she was willing to discuss. "I am," Sarah replied. "But this happened at work, so it goes through the civilian system first. Workers' compensation has to document everything before VA can determine if there are any overlapping issues." The explanation was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had navigated bureaucratic systems extensively and understood exactly how multiple agencies coordinated care for people who fell into various administrative categories. It was the kind of knowledge that most people acquired only through extensive personal experience with complex medical and governmental systems. Dr. Vasquez continued her examination, noting that despite the obvious pain Sarah was experiencing, her vital signs remained remarkably stable. Heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory function all indicated someone whose body was accustomed to managing stress and discomfort without the kind of systemic response that most people showed when dealing with significant injuries. "I'm going to need to order some imaging," Dr. Vasquez said, pulling off her examination gloves and making notes on the chart. "Cucuray's definitely, probably an MRI to get a clear picture of the soft tissue damage. The good news is that everything suggests this is treatable without surgical intervention, but we need to make sure we're not missing anything that could cause problems later." Sarah nodded, accepting the information with the kind of patience that suggested she'd been through similar diagnostic processes before. "How long do you think the imaging will take?" "Probably another hour or two, depending on how backed up radiology is tonight," Dr. Vasquez replied. "I know you've been here for a while already. Do you have someone we can call? Family, friends, someone who should know where you are?" The question was routine, the kind of thing medical professionals asked every patient as a matter of standard procedure. But Sarah's response suggested it wasn't as simple as it appeared. "No," she said quietly. "There's no one who needs to be notified." Dr. Vasquez looked up from her chart, struck by something in Sarah's tone that went beyond simple independence. In her experience, most people had someone they wanted contacted during medical emergencies, even if it was just to arrange for transportation home or help with daily activities during recovery. The complete absence of anyone to notify suggested either deliberate isolation or circumstances that had left Sarah without the kind of support network that most people took for granted. "What about work?" Dr. Vasquez asked. "Will someone be expecting you, or do you need to notify your employer about what happened?" "It's handled," Sarah replied. "The site supervisor filed all the necessary reports. My company knows where I am and why." Again, the response suggested familiarity with procedures and protocols that went beyond what most people would know about workplace injury documentation. Sarah spoke like someone who understood exactly how accidents were reported, investigated, and processed through various administrative systems. Dr. Vasquez found herself increasingly curious about the woman sitting on her examination table. The combination of extensive combat medical history, detailed knowledge of bureaucratic procedures, and complete absence of personal support network painted a picture of someone whose life had been shaped by experiences that most people never encountered. But it was the way Sarah carried herself that was most intriguing. Despite being alone in an emergency room in the middle of the night, dealing with a painful injury and wearing a hospital gown that afforded little dignity, she maintained a composure that suggested complete confidence in her ability to handle whatever came next. Not the false bravado that some people use to mask fear or uncertainty, but genuine self-assurance based on having successfully navigated situations far more challenging than this one. "I'll get the radiology technician to come get you, doctor," Vasquez said, standing to leave but pausing at the door. "Ms. Martinez, can I ask you something?" Sarah looked at her expectantly, neither encouraging the question nor discouraging it. "In my experience, Doctor," Vasquez continued, "people who've served in combat zones often have difficulty adjusting to civilian medical care. The pace is different, the procedures are different, and sometimes the level of attention to what might seem like minor details can be frustrating for people who are used to more immediate intervention. Are you comfortable with how we're handling your treatment?" The question revealed that Dr. Vasquez had recognized something about Sarah's background and was trying to Provide the kind of care that would be most effective for someone with her experience. It was the kind of thoughtful attention that separated good medical professionals from merely competent ones. Sarah considered the question seriously before responding. "You're being thorough and professional," she said. "I appreciate that you're taking time to make sure you understand the full extent of the injury before deciding on treatment. That's exactly the kind of approach that prevents complications later." Dr. Vasquez smiled, recognizing the response as both a compliment and an indication that Sarah had extensive experience evaluating medical care. "Good. If you need anything while you're waiting for imaging, let the nursing staff know. And if you have any questions about the treatment plan, don't hesitate to ask." After Dr. Vasquez left, Sarah sat alone in the examination room, listening to the ambient sounds of the hospital around her. Conversations in the hallway, equipment being moved from room to room, the distant sound of medical procedures being conducted behind closed doors. It was a different kind of activity from what she was accustomed to, focused on healing rather than survival, but there were similarities in the way people moved with purpose and communicated with precision when lives depended on getting things right. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Martinez, I'm here to take you for your x-rays." The radiology technician was a young man named Marcus, who had the kind of cheerful efficiency that suggested he enjoyed his work. Despite the late hour, he maneuvered the wheelchair with practiced ease, chatting casually about the weather and the unusually busy night the emergency room was having. "Must be the full moon," he said as they moved through corridors lined with medical equipment and motivational posters. "Always seems like the weird stuff happens when there's a full moon." Sarah made appropriate responses to his conversation, but she was paying more attention to the layout of the hospital and the security procedures she observed along the way. It was a habit developed over years of operating in unfamiliar environments, automatically cataloging exits, communication systems, and the general flow of activity in any new location. The radiology department was quieter than the emergency room, with the kind of subdued lighting that suggested people were trying to minimize disruption to patients who might be dealing with pain or anxiety about their medical conditions. Marcus positioned her for the first series of X-rays with the kind of gentle competence that indicated extensive experience with injured people. "This might be uncomfortable," he warned, as he adjusted her shoulder for the optimal angle. "Try to hold still, but let me know if it's too much." Sarah remained motionless during the imaging, breathing steadily through discomfort that was significant, but manageable. She'd learned long ago that pain was information, useful for understanding the extent of damage, but not necessarily something that required immediate response. The key was distinguishing between pain that indicated ongoing damage and pain that was simply the body's way of reporting on injuries that were already sustained. "You're a good patient," Marcus commented as he reviewed the images on his monitor. "Most people have trouble staying still when they're hurt like that." "I've had practice," Sarah replied, which was true enough without being specific about the circumstances that had provided that practice. Marcus glanced at her curiously, recognizing that her response suggested more experience with medical imaging than most people accumulated through routine healthcare. But he was professional enough not to pry into personal information that wasn't relevant to his job. "We'll need a few more angles," he said, repositioning the equipment. "Then Dr. Vasquez can get a clear picture of what's going on in there." While Marcus worked, Sarah found herself thinking about the confrontation in the waiting room and the assumptions that had led to it. She'd encountered similar situations before, though usually not quite so dramatically. There was something about her appearance, her demeanor, or the way she moved through the world that caused some people to make judgments about her circumstances, her capabilities, or her worthiness of respect. In some ways, she understood it. She didn't dress to impress people, didn't carry herself in ways that demanded attention, and didn't display the markers of success or achievement that some people use to signal their importance to the world. Her value system had been shaped by experiences where appearance mattered far less than competence, where respect was earned through actions rather than symbols, and where the most important qualities a person could possess were often invisible to casual observation. But she also understood that civilian society operated according to different rules, where first impressions carried more weight and where people made decisions about how to treat others based on limited information and social cues that she'd never learned to display effectively. The young women in the waiting room hadn't been inherently malicious, just products of a system that had taught them to judge worth based on criteria that bore little relationship to actual character or achievement. "All done," Marcus announced, helping her back into the wheelchair. "Dr. Vasquez should have the results in about 15 minutes. The trip back to the examination room gave Sarah another opportunity to observe the hospital's operation and the people who kept it functioning during the overnight hours. She noticed the way staff members communicated with each other, the efficiency with which they moved through their routines, and the general sense of professional competence that characterized well-run medical facilities. It reminded her of other organizations she'd been part of, places where everyone understood their role and took pride in performing it well. The motivations were different, and the stakes were usually different, but there were similarities in the way people worked together when they understood that their individual performance affected the welfare of others. Dr. Vasquez was waiting. When they returned to the examination room, the X-ray images already displayed on a computer monitor that she'd positioned so Sarah could see them clearly. The black and white pictures showed the internal structure of her shoulder with startling clarity, revealing exactly how the joint had been displaced and which ligaments had been damaged. "Good news and bad news," Dr. Vasquez said, pointing to specific areas on the images. "The good news is that there's no fracture, and the displacement isn't as severe as it could have been. The bad news is that you've got some significant ligament damage that's going to require several weeks of careful rehabilitation." Sarah studied the images with the kind of focused attention that most patients didn't bring to their own medical diagnostics. She could see the areas Dr. Vasquez was indicating, could understand the relationship between the visible damage and the pain she was experiencing, and could begin to develop realistic expectations about recovery time and limitations. "What's the treatment protocol?" she asked, her tone indicating that she wanted specific information rather than general reassurance. "Immobilization for the first week to allow the initial inflammation to subside," Dr. Vasquez replied, clearly recognizing that Sarah wanted detailed medical information. "Then controlled movement exercises to prevent scar tissue formation. Physical therapy starting in about 10 days, gradually increasing range of motion and strength training. Full recovery should take 6 to 8 weeks if you follow the rehabilitation program exactly." Sarah nodded, processing the timeline and beginning to think about how it would affect her work schedule and daily activities. 6 to 8 weeks was manageable, assuming there were no complications and assuming she could maintain the discipline necessary for proper rehabilitation. "Any restrictions on activities during recovery?" she asked. "No lifting anything heavier than 10 pounds for the first 3 weeks, Dr. Vasquez said. "No overhead movements until physical therapy clears you for them. And absolutely no activities that could result in re-injury during the initial healing phase." The restrictions were reasonable and consistent with what Sarah had expected based on her previous experience with similar injuries. The key would be balancing the need for rest with the need to maintain overall fitness and prevent the kind of muscle atrophy that could complicate recovery. "I'll write you a prescription for pain medication," Dr. Vasquez continued. "But given your medical history, I suspect you'll prefer to manage discomfort with over-the-counter options unless it becomes unmanageable." The observation was accurate. Sarah had learned through experience that prescription pain medication often interfered with the kind of clear thinking she preferred to maintain, and that most discomfort was tolerable if you understood its source and had confidence in the recovery. Process. That's fine, Sarah agreed. Is there anything else I need to know about managing this injury? Dr. Vasquez handed her several sheets of printed information about shoulder rehabilitation, along with referrals to physical therapy services and instructions for follow-up care. The most important thing is patience, she said. Ligament injuries heal slowly, and trying to rush the process usually results in setbacks that extend recovery time. Sarah accepted the paperwork and stood carefully, testing her balance and range of motion now that she had a clear understanding of the extent of her injuries. The sling felt more secure now that it had been properly fitted, and the pain medication they'd given her earlier was beginning to take effect. "Thank you," she said, offering Dr. Vasquez the kind of genuine appreciation that medical professionals didn't always receive from patients who were dealing with pain and inconvenience. "You've been very thorough and professional." Dr. Vasquez smiled, recognizing the compliment as coming from someone who had experience evaluating medical care. "Take care of yourself, Ms. Martinez, and don't hesitate to come back if you have any concerns about the healing process." As Sarah prepared to leave the treatment area, she realized that she would have to walk back through the waiting room where the confrontation with the college students had occurred. She wasn't particularly concerned about facing them again, but she was curious about whether the incident had affected the atmosphere of the emergency room, or whether life had simply continued around it as if nothing had happened. The waiting room looked different now, partly because several hours had passed and the patient population had changed, but partly because Sarah was seeing it from a different perspective. She was no longer someone waiting for unknown treatment, but someone who understood exactly what was wrong and exactly what needed to be done to fix it. That knowledge changed how she experienced the space and the people in it. Ashley and her friends were still there, though they were sitting in different chairs and their demeanor had changed completely. They were speaking quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing toward the treatment area as if they were waiting for something. When they saw Sarah emerge from the corridor that led to the examination rooms, their conversation stopped entirely. Sarah approached them with the same steady pace she'd maintained throughout the evening, neither hurrying nor hesitating. She was wearing her torn shirt again, having declined the hospital's offer of a replacement garment, and the Medal of Honor tattoo was still visible through the damaged fabric. "How are you feeling?" Ashley asked, her voice carrying a sincerity that hadn't been present during their earlier interaction. The question seemed genuine rather than perfunctory, as if she actually cared about the answer. "I'll be fine," Sarah replied. 6 to 8 weeks of rehabilitation, but no permanent damage. The relief on Ashley's face was unmistakable, suggesting that she'd been genuinely worried about the possibility that the injury might be more serious than it had appeared. It was a level of concern that indicated she'd been thinking about the incident and its implications for several hours. "We've been talking," Jessica said, her voice uncertain but determined, "about what happened earlier. About what we did, and why we did it." Sarah waited, neither encouraging nor discouraging whatever they wanted to say. "We realize we made assumptions about you that were completely wrong," Brittany continued. "And we treated you in a way that was unacceptable regardless of who you were or what your circumstances might have been." The apology was more thoughtful than Sarah had expected, suggesting that they'd used the time while she was being treated to have the kind of conversation that might actually lead to changed behavior rather than just temporary embarrassment. "We want to understand," Ashley said, her voice carrying the kind of humility that suggested she was prepared to listen rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. "We want to understand how we got it so wrong and what we can do differently in the future." Sarah studied the three young women, assessing their sincerity and their capacity for the kind of genuine self-examination that could lead to growth. What she saw was promising but not conclusive. They were clearly affected by what had happened, but whether that impact would translate into lasting change remained to be seen. "What do you think you did wrong?" Sarah asked, turning the question back to them rather than simply providing answers they might not be ready to understand. Ashley looked at her friends, then back at Sarah. "We judge you based on appearance instead of treating you with basic respect," she said slowly. "We assumed that we had the right to determine who belonged where and who deserved what kind of treatment. And we acted on those assumptions in a way that was cruel and humiliating. The analysis was accurate as far as it went, but Sarah sensed there were deeper issues that they hadn't yet recognized or weren't ready to articulate. And why do you think you made those assumptions?" Sarah asked. The question was more challenging, requiring them to examine not just their actions, but the underlying attitudes and beliefs that had motivated those actions. It was the kind of self-reflection that many people avoided because it required acknowledging uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world they'd grown up in. Because we're used to thinking that our opinions matter more than other people's dignity, Jessica said quietly, the words coming out as if she was discovering the truth as she spoke it. Because we've been taught that having advantages means we're better than people who don't have those same advantages. The insight was more profound than Sarah had expected from someone who'd been participating in the kind of behavior they were now analyzing. It suggested that Jessica, at least, was capable of the kind of honest self-examination that could lead to genuine change. "And what are you going to do with that understanding?" Sarah asked. The question was the real test. Understanding was valuable, but change required action based on that understanding. Sarah had seen many people who could analyze their mistakes with impressive clarity, but who continued making the same mistakes because analysis without implementation was simply an intellectual exercise. "We're going to approach people differently," Ashley said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure what that meant in practical terms. "We're going to try to remember that everyone has a story we don't know and experiences we can't understand just by looking at them. And we're going to speak up when we see other people making the same kinds of assumptions we made," Brittany added. "Because staying silent when you see someone being treated unfairly is almost as bad as doing it yourself." The commitment was encouraging, though Sarah knew that actually following through on such promises required more sustained effort than most people realized. Good intentions were abundant, but consistent behavior change was rare. "Those are good goals," Sarah said. "But remember that changing how you think about other people is harder than it sounds. You'll have to consciously work against assumptions and attitudes that feel natural because they're what you've been taught since childhood." She looked at each of them in turn, making sure they understood that what she was about to say was important. "The real test won't be how you treat people when you're thinking about what happened here tonight. It'll be how you treat people when you're tired or stressed or distracted, or when you think no one is watching. It'll be whether you extend the same respect to people who can't do anything for you as you do to people who can help or hurt you." The waiting room had grown quiet around them, with other patients and staff members occasionally glancing in their direction but respecting the obvious seriousness of the conversation taking place. "Can you tell us about the Medal of Honor?" Ashley asked suddenly, her voice carrying genuine curiosity, rather than the morbid fascination that some people showed when they encountered military decorations. "Not about what you did to earn it, but about what it means to you." The question surprised Sarah, both because it was more thoughtful than she'd expected, and because it required her to articulate something she rarely discussed even with people who shared her background. "It means that on one particular day, I made choices that saved other people's lives," she said slowly. "But it also means that I was in a situation where those choices were necessary, which means that other people were in danger that could have been prevented if the world worked differently." She paused, considering how to explain something that was both deeply personal and fundamentally about service to others. Most people see military decorations as recognition of individual achievement. She continued, "But for the people who receive them, They're usually reminders of situations where achievement was measured by how many people made it home safely. The medal itself matters less than the knowledge that the choices it represents were the right ones to make under the circumstances. The explanation seemed to resonate with the three women, who were listening with the kind of focused attention that suggested they were trying to understand something outside their previous experience. "Do you regret it?" Jessica asked. "Not what you did, but the fact that you had to do it?" The question revealed a level of insight that surprised Sarah. Jessica had recognized that heroic actions often came at personal cost, and that people who were honored for extraordinary service might have complex feelings about the circumstances that had required such service. "I regret that the situation existed," Sarah said. "I regret that people were put in danger, and I regret that other approaches to the problem had failed. But I don't regret the choices I made once I was there." It was as honest an answer as she could give to people who had no framework for understanding the complexities of combat or the long-term psychological impact of making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another hospital staff member, a social worker who'd apparently been asked to check on the situation in the waiting room. She approached their group with the careful attention of someone who'd been told there had been some kind of incident, but wasn't sure what kind of intervention might be appropriate. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her tone professional but concerned. "Everything's fine," Sarah replied, recognizing that the social worker was probably responding to reports about the earlier confrontation. "These ladies were apologizing for a misunderstanding, and we've worked things out." The social worker looked at the torn shirt, the visible tattoo, and the body language of the four women, clearly trying to assess whether there were ongoing issues that needed to be addressed. But what she saw was a conversation that appeared to be concluding on positive terms with no obvious signs of continuing conflict. "All right," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced that everything was as resolved as Sarah claimed. "If anyone needs to talk about what happened earlier, my office is just down the hall." After the social worker left, the group stood in somewhat awkward silence, as if they all recognized that their conversation had reached a natural conclusion, but weren't sure how to end it appropriately. "We should let you go," Ashley said finally. "You've been here all night, and you need to get some rest." Sarah nodded, adjusting the strap of her bag and checking to make sure she had all the paperwork Dr. Vasquez had given her. "Take care of yourselves," she said, "and remember what we talked about." As she walked toward the exit, Sarah could hear the three women resuming their conversation behind her, their voices subdued but engaged. She didn't turn around to listen, but she hoped that the discussion would continue and that the insights they'd gained would translate into lasting changes in how they approached other people. The automatic doors opened as she approached, releasing her into the cool night air that felt refreshing after the recirculated atmosphere of the hospital. The parking lot was less crowded now, with most of the emergency traffic having been processed and released. Her ride-share driver was waiting where she'd arranged to meet him, patient despite the late hour and the uncertainty about when she'd be ready to leave. "How did it go?" he asked as she settled carefully into the passenger seat, mindful of her injured shoulder. "Better than expected," Sarah replied, which was true in ways that had nothing to do with her medical treatment. As they drove through the quiet streets toward her apartment, Sarah found herself thinking about the evening's events and what they revealed about human nature, assumption, and the possibility for growth and change. The confrontation in the waiting room had been unpleasant, but it had also created an opportunity for education and understanding that might not have existed otherwise. The young women who had approached her with such misguided confidence had been forced to confront the limitations of their worldview and the potential consequences of their assumptions. Whether they would follow through on their expressed intentions to approach people differently remained to be seen, but at least they now had the knowledge necessary to make better choices if they chose to use it. The city lights blurred past the car window as Sarah considered the broader implications of what had happened. How many other people were walking through the world, carrying invisible burdens, unrecognized achievements, or quiet wisdom that wasn't apparent to casual observers? How many opportunities for connection and understanding were lost because people made judgments based on surface appearances rather than taking time to discover what lay beneath? The metal tattooed on her shoulder was unusual in its specificity and significance, but everyone carried something that made them more complex and interesting than they appeared to be at first glance. The challenge was developing the habit of approaching people with curiosity and respect rather than judgment and assumption. As the car turned into her neighborhood, Sarah realized that despite the pain in her shoulder and the exhaustion of a very long day, she felt oddly optimistic about human nature and the potential for people to learn and grow from their mistakes. It wasn't universal, and it wasn't automatic, but it was possible. And in a world that often seemed determined to highlight the worst aspects of human behavior, possibility was worth holding on to. 2 weeks after the emergency room incident, Sarah was back at the construction site where her injury had occurred. Not to work, but to complete the final paperwork for the workers' compensation claim. The shoulder was healing well within the expected timeline, though the physical therapy sessions were more challenging than she'd anticipated. Recovery always required patience, but there was something particularly frustrating about being limited by an injury that had resulted from protecting others rather than from any mistake or carelessness on her part. The site supervisor, Mike Chun, met her at the trailer that served as the temporary office for the renovation project. He was a veteran himself, though his service had been in the Navy rather than the Army, and he understood better than most civilian supervisors the particular way that military personnel approached both work and injury. "How's the shoulder holding up?" he asked as they settled into the cramped office space that smelled of coffee and construction dust. "Progress is steady," Sarah replied, signing the forms that would close out her case and allow her to return to work once the physical therapist cleared her for full duty. "Should be back to regular activities within the month." Mike nodded, but she could see that he had something else on his mind beyond the administrative details of her injury claim. He'd been unusually quiet during their conversation, and she recognized the body language of someone who wanted to discuss something, but wasn't sure how to bring it up. "There's something else," he said finally, confirming her assessment. "Something happened yesterday that I thought you should know about." Sarah waited, her experience having taught her that people usually got to their point more quickly if you didn't rush them through whatever preliminaries they felt were necessary. 3 young women came by the site, Mike continued. College age, well-dressed, driving expensive cars. They were asking about you specifically, wanted to know if you worked here and whether they could speak with you. The description was distinctive enough that Sarah immediately understood who they were talking about, though she was surprised that Ashley and her friends had taken the initiative to track her down. Their conversation at the hospital had seemed to end on a positive note, but she hadn't expected any follow-up contact. "Did they say what they wanted?" Sarah asked. "They were pretty vague about that," Mike replied. "Just said they'd met you at the hospital and wanted to continue a conversation they'd started there. I told them I couldn't give out personal information about employees, but I said I'd let you know they'd stopped by if you were interested in contacting them." He handed her a business card that looked expensive and understated, the kind that people used when they wanted to project success without appearing flashy. Ashley Morrison, it read, with a phone number and an email address, but no indication of profession or affiliation. "They left this and said you'd understand the context," Mike added. "Also said to tell you that they'd been thinking about what you discussed and wanted to share something with you if you were willing to listen." Sarah studied the card, considering whether she wanted to re-engage with people who'd caused her considerable aggravation during what was already a difficult evening. On one hand, She wasn't particularly interested in becoming a mentor or teacher for young people who needed to learn basic lessons about treating others with respect. On the other hand, the fact that they'd made an effort to find her suggested that their conversation at the hospital might have had more impact than she'd realized. "I'll think about it," she said, tucking the card into her wallet next to her military ID. "Thanks for letting me know." The drive home gave her time to consider whether she wanted to respond to Ashley's apparent attempt to continue their conversation. Her inclination was to let the matter rest where they'd left it at the hospital. She'd said what needed to be said about respect and assumptions, and whether they chose to apply those lessons was their responsibility, not hers. But as she thought about the three young women and the way their attitudes had shifted during their conversation, she found herself curious about what they wanted to discuss. The fact that they'd gone to the trouble of tracking down her workplace suggested that whatever they had to say was more than just additional apologies or expressions of gratitude. That evening, as she worked through the physical therapy exercises that were gradually restoring strength and mobility to her injured shoulder, Sarah made her decision. She would call Ashley, not because she felt obligated to continue educating people who should have learned basic courtesy years earlier, but because she was genuinely curious about what had motivated them to seek her out. The conversation was brief and somewhat awkward, with Ashley clearly nervous about the possibility that Sarah might not be interested in meeting again. But when she explained what she wanted to discuss, Sarah found herself agreeing to a coffee meeting the following afternoon. "We've been doing something since that night," Ashley said, her voice carrying an excitement that seemed genuine rather than performative. "Something we thought you might want to know about, given what you taught us about assumptions and respect." The coffee shop Ashley had suggested was in a part of town that Sarah rarely visited, the kind of place that catered to university students and young professionals with disposable income and flexible schedules. When she arrived, she found all three women already seated at a corner table, their body language suggesting they'd been having an intense conversation before her arrival. Ashley stood as she approached, a gesture of respect that Sarah noted, but didn't comment on. The young woman looked different than she had at the hospital, more serious and thoughtful, as if the intervening weeks had required her to reconsider fundamental aspects of how she moved through the world. "Thank you for coming," Ashley said as Sarah settled into the remaining chair. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see us again after what happened." "I'm curious about what you wanted to discuss," Sarah replied, accepting the coffee that Jessica had apparently ordered for her. "Your message suggested you had something specific to share." The three women exchanged glances, and Sarah could see that they'd rehearsed this conversation, but were still uncertain about how to begin. Finally, Brittany pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a video that had obviously been recorded on campus. "We've been watching," Brittany said as the video began to play. "Watching how people treat others, watching our own behavior, watching the assumptions people make every day." The video showed a scene that was depressingly familiar, a group of students mocking a maintenance worker who was trying to clean up after a party that had gotten out of hand. The maintenance worker was an older man, probably in his 60s, who was methodically picking up trash and broken bottles while students made comments about his appearance, his job, and his presumed circumstances. "We used to be those people," Jessica said quietly, her voice carrying shame that seemed genuine. "We used to think that because we were students, and he was maintenance staff, we were somehow better than him or more important than him." The video continued, showing the maintenance worker's patient dignity in the face of casual cruelty that was being delivered by people who probably didn't even realize how harmful their behavior was. Sarah could see the parallels to her own experience at the hospital, though the dynamics were somewhat different. "What changed?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "We started thinking about what you said," Ashley replied. "About approaching people with respect instead of making them prove they deserve it." And we realized that we were surrounded by people we'd been dismissing or ignoring based on assumptions about their worth or importance. She gestured toward the phone where the video had moved on to show a different scene. So we started paying attention. Really paying attention to how we and our friends treat people who we think are beneath us or who can't do anything for us. What Sarah saw in the subsequent clips was a catalog of casual disrespect that ranged from mildly rude to genuinely cruel. Students talking down to food service workers, dismissing cleaning staff as if they were invisible, making assumptions about people's intelligence or education based on their jobs or appearance. It was the kind of behavior that was so common. It usually passed unnoticed, but when compiled and viewed systematically, it painted a disturbing picture of how privileged young people related to those they considered their social inferiors. And then we started intervening, Brittany said, advancing the video to clips that showed the three women interrupting similar scenes, speaking up when they saw others being treated disrespectfully, and making efforts to engage with people they'd previously ignored. The changes in their behavior were obvious and encouraging, but Sarah could see that their interventions were sometimes awkward and not always well received. Learning to treat people with respect was apparently more complicated than simply deciding to do so. It's harder than we thought it would be, Jessica admitted. People don't always want to be told that they're being disrespectful, and sometimes our attempts to help just make situations more uncomfortable for everyone involved. Sarah nodded, recognizing the challenge they were describing. Good intentions didn't automatically translate into effective action, and people who were trying to change entrenched patterns of behavior often discovered that the process was more complex than they'd anticipated. What have you learned from these experiences? Sarah asked, genuinely curious about their insights. That most people don't even realize they're doing it, Ashley said immediately. They're not trying to be cruel or dismissive. They just never learn to see certain types of people as fully human or deserving of consideration. And that changing your own behavior is only the first step, Brittany added. If you want to make a real difference, you have to find ways to influence the culture around you, not just your individual actions. The observation was more sophisticated than Sarah had expected, suggesting that their thinking about these issues had evolved considerably since their initial encounter. They were beginning to understand that respect and dignity were not just personal choices, but collective responsibilities that required sustained effort and social coordination. Which brings us to why we wanted to talk to you, Jessica said, her tone becoming more serious. We've been documenting all of this, not just our own learning process, but the broader patterns we've observed on campus. And we want to do something with it that might actually make a difference. Ashley leaned forward, her expression intense, with the kind of focused energy that suggested she'd found something she genuinely cared about. We want to create a program that teaches people to recognize these patterns in their own behavior and gives them tools for treating others with more respect and dignity. The proposal was ambitious and well-intentioned, but Sarah could see potential problems with the approach. Programs designed to change social behavior were notoriously difficult to implement effectively, particularly when they required people to acknowledge and modify attitudes that they might not even recognize they possessed. What kind of program are you envisioning? Sarah asked, wanting to understand their thinking before offering any feedback. Something that uses real examples like the ones we've been collecting, Brittany explained. Not lectures or abstract discussions about respect, but concrete demonstrations of how these interactions play out in daily life and what different approaches might look like. We've been working with the Campus Counseling Center and some faculty members who specialize in social psychology, Ashley added. They think the approach has potential, but they want us to get input from people who have direct experience with being on the receiving end of the kind of behavior we're trying to address. The request made sense, and Sarah could see that they'd put considerable thought into developing an approach that might actually be effective rather than just making them feel better about their own behavior. But she also recognized that asking her to participate in their project was a significant request that would require her to share experiences and insights that she generally kept private. "You want me to help you understand what it's like to be dismissed or disrespected based on assumptions about your background or circumstances," Sarah said, clarifying what they were asking. "We want to learn from someone whose actual achievements and character are so far beyond what we initially assumed that our mistakes become undeniably obvious," Jessica replied. "Most people can rationalize their assumptions when the truth is ambiguous. But when someone with a Medal of Honor is treated like they don't belong in an emergency room, the disconnect is too clear to ignore." The explanation revealed a level of strategic thinking that impressed Sarah. They understood that effective education often required examples that were dramatic enough to overcome people's natural resistance to examining their own behavior and assumptions. "What would my participation involve?" Sarah asked, still uncommitted, but willing to learn more about what they had in mind. "Mostly just sharing your perspective on situations like what happened at the hospital," Ashley said. "Helping people understand what it feels like to be judged and dismissed based on appearance, and what kinds of interactions feel respectful versus disrespectful when you're dealing with people who don't know your background. And maybe helping us understand how to approach these conversations in ways that actually change behavior rather than just making people defensive," Brittany added. The request was reasonable, and Sarah found herself increasingly interested in their project. The young women had clearly learned from their mistakes and were now trying to use that learning to help others avoid similar errors in judgment. It was exactly the kind of constructive response that she'd hoped their hospital conversation might inspire. "I'll consider it," Sarah said, which was more commitment than she'd planned to offer when she'd agreed to meet with them. "Send me more information about what you're planning, and I'll let you know if I think I can contribute something useful." The relief on their faces was obvious, suggesting that her potential participation meant more to them than she'd realized. As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Ashley hesitated as if she wanted to say something else, but wasn't sure whether it was appropriate. "There's one more thing," she said finally. "Something personal that I wanted you to know." Sarah waited, curious about what else Ashley felt compelled to share. "I called my father," Ashley continued, her voice becoming quieter. "Told him about what happened at the hospital and what I learned from it. About the assumptions I'd been making about people and how wrong I'd been." She paused, clearly finding the memory emotionally difficult. "He told me that he'd noticed the way I treated people who worked for our family or who provided services to us, and he'd been waiting for me to figure out on my own that it was unacceptable. He said he was proud that I'd finally learned the lesson, but disappointed that it had taken so long and that someone else had to teach it to me." The confession revealed layers of family dynamics and personal growth that Sarah hadn't expected to hear about. It also suggested that Ashley's learning process was continuing beyond their immediate interaction and affecting other relationships in her life. "What did you tell him about what you learned?" Sarah asked. "That respect isn't something you give to people after they prove they deserve it," Ashley replied. "It's something you give to people because they're human beings, and then you withdraw it only if they prove they don't deserve it. And that most of the time. The people who seem most ordinary or unremarkable are carrying stories and experiences that would change how you see them if you took the time to learn about them." The summary was accurate and thoughtful, suggesting that Ashley had internalized the lesson rather than just understanding it intellectually. Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction that was rare in her interactions with civilians. The knowledge that something she'd said had genuinely influenced how someone else approached the world. As they walked toward the parking lot, Sarah found herself thinking about the unexpected trajectory that had led from a painful confrontation in an emergency room to a collaborative effort to help other people learn similar lessons without having to experience similar mistakes. It wasn't the kind of outcome she could have predicted, but it was the kind of positive development that reminded her why service to others remained worthwhile even when it was difficult or frustrating. "One last question," Jessica said as they reached Sarah's car. "Do you ever regret getting involved in situations where you could just walk away? I mean, you could have just ignored us at the hospital, or refused to meet with us today, or told us that teaching us respect wasn't your responsibility." The question touched on something Sarah had been thinking about throughout their conversation. She could have avoided all of this complexity by simply accepting the apology they'd offered at the hospital and moving on with her life. There would have been nothing wrong with that choice, and most people would probably have made it. "I've learned that walking away is sometimes the right choice," Sarah said slowly. "But when people are genuinely willing to learn and grow from their mistakes, helping them do that is usually worth the effort. Not because I have an obligation to educate everyone who treats me poorly, but because people who learn to treat others with respect make the world better for everyone." She paused, looking at the three young women who had managed to transform a moment of cruelty into an opportunity for growth and positive action. "Besides," she added with a slight smile, "you prove that people can change when they want to. That's not something you see every day, and it's worth supporting when you do encounter it." As Sarah drove home, she reflected on the unexpected developments that had emerged from what had started as a routine workplace injury and a frustrating encounter with privileged young people who'd never learned basic courtesy. The story could have ended badly, with hurt feelings and missed opportunities for growth. Instead, it had become something that might actually make a positive difference in how other people approached each other. The medal tattooed on her shoulder had originally been intended as a private reminder of service and sacrifice that didn't need public recognition or explanation. But in revealing it to people who needed to understand the gap between appearance and reality, it had become something else, a teaching tool that could help others learn to look beyond surface judgments and recognize the complexity and worth of every person they encountered. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same assumptions and prejudices that had led to her being disrespected at the hospital had also created the conditions for a conversation that might help prevent similar disrespect from happening to others. Sometimes the most valuable lessons emerged from the most unpleasant experiences, and sometimes the people who seemed least likely to change were actually the most capable of growth when given the right motivation and support. 3 months later, Sarah received an email with a video attachment from Ashley. The video showed a presentation being given to incoming freshmen at the university, featuring the clips they'd collected of respectful and disrespectful interactions, along with discussions about the hidden stories that every person carried and the importance of approaching others with dignity rather than judgment. The presentation was well received, according to Ashley's accompanying note, and had already been requested by several other universities interested in addressing similar issues on their own campuses. More importantly, follow-up surveys suggested that students who attended the presentation were more likely to intervene when they witnessed disrespectful behavior and more conscious of their own assumptions about people they encountered. Sarah watched the video with interest, noting how Ashley, Jessica, and Brittany had developed as speakers and educators. They were still learning, still making mistakes in their approach, but they were committed to the work and improving with practice. The shy uncertainty that had characterized their initial attempts to change their behavior had been replaced by confident advocacy for treating others with dignity. The program wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't solve all the problems of prejudice and assumption that made life more difficult than necessary for people who didn't fit conventional expectations of success or importance. But it was a start, and it was being implemented by people who had learned their lessons the hard way and were committed to helping others avoid similar mistakes. Sarah filed the email in a folder she'd created for updates about the project, then returned to her physical therapy exercises. Her shoulder was nearly back to full strength, and she would be returning to work the following week. The construction site would present its own challenges and rewards, its own opportunities to serve others through competent professional work that helped create safe and functional spaces for people to live and work. It wasn't the same kind of service she'd provided during her military career, but it was service nonetheless. And sometimes, as she'd learned from her encounter with 3 college students in an emergency room, the most important service happened in moments when you weren't expecting it, with people you never planned to meet, in circumstances that started badly but ended with everyone involved understanding something important about themselves and the world they shared. The medal on her shoulder would always be a reminder of one particular day when extraordinary choices had been necessary to save lives that might otherwise have been lost. But it had also become a reminder that teaching and learning could happen anywhere, that respect was something worth both demanding and offering, and that the most unlikely encounters sometimes produced the most valuable outcomes. As she worked through the final repetitions of her rehabilitation routine, Sarah found herself looking forward to returning to work, to the familiar challenges of ensuring safety and quality in construction projects, and to whatever unexpected opportunities for service might emerge from simply doing her job well and treating the people she encountered with the dignity they deserved. The story that had begun with assumptions and ended with education was finished, but the lessons it contained would continue influencing how everyone involved approached their relationships with others. And sometimes that was the most important kind of service anyone could provide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.